他是克林顿政府的重要幕僚，他参与推动中国加入世贸组织，他使世界银行重焕活力，他是2013网易经济学家年会的贵宾。他如何看世界与中国经济？他会给中国开出怎样的稳增长妙方？他为何认为国有企业有可能成为改革的阻碍？
Because as China has grown, you asked about state-owned enterprises, it's built-in interest groups, and they don't necessarily want to have change.
他为何认为中国不会大规模抛售美国国债？
China buying dollar securities is not a charity. China's borrowing them in part because it was trying to maintain its currency at a certain value.
他如何看待中国年轻一代的责任？
Particularly for younger Chinese, who live in a world of microblogging, is how will they get connected to the change and reform process?
网易财经专访世界银行前行长、美国前国务卿罗伯特·佐利克，精彩内容即将呈现。谈到当年参与中国加入 WTO 的经历，佐利克回忆说，江泽民主席和朱镕基总理利用中国入世推动了中国结构性改革，成果显著，值得学习。谈到中国的国企问题，佐利克认为，国企阻碍了私营部门的发展，应全方位改革。
You had played a very important role when China joined the WTO. Do you have any precious memories you would like to share with us?
I came in after, I think, Zhu Rongji and the Chinese officials had made the critical strategic decision. And I think the real lesson to be learned there is that Jiang Zemin and Zhu Rongji used the WTO accession to push that generation of structural reforms. That's what really pushed some of the economic growth. And because the nature of the WTO as trade is microeconomic rules, it's creating competition. And I think that some of the ideas that came out of that process pushed China's growth for 10 years, and China has benefited from the world economy. But the lesson to be learned there is that you can't stop. So in a sense, the question would be, what would Zhu Rongji do today? And how might he use the intersection with the international system to try to prod ongoing reforms in China? Now, those are only questions that the Chinese can answer. But going back to the sort of genius of Deng Xiaoping, it helps to be open to the international system, to get their ideas, and it helps to be practical. I think one of the things about China's reform that has been very impressive is sort of the feedback loops from experiments in different places.
When World Bank makes suggestions to countries, what proposals and principles would that be based on?
Well, the bank tries to work with countries as clients. So the start is really what the country is interested in and the problems that it wants to try to solve. But in trying to help countries, the World Bank is able to draw on the experience of many other countries. So the resources are a combination of financial and knowledge. And in knowledge, it's drawn from worldwide experience, as well as research, and always an ongoing learning process. But I guess what would distinguish the World Bank from, say, the IMF is the World Bank works on more microeconomic or structural issues of reform as opposed to the large macroeconomic policies of budget and inflation and monetary issues.
In February this year, World Bank gave out several suggestions on the reform of China's state-owned enterprises. So, in your opinion, which aspects need to be implemented presently?
Well, I know that the issue of state-owned enterprises captures a lot of attention because they're very big and important in the Chinese economy. What I and others have seen around the world with other state-owned enterprises is that sometimes they run the risk of blocking the development of private sector firms because the state-owned enterprises have particular benefits in terms of government financing or monopoly or oligopoly positions. But on the other hand, sometimes the state-owned enterprises managers feel restricted because they may not be able to do, say, an acquisition unless it's approved by the state council. So the challenge is really to remove barriers to entry, create more private sector opportunities. For the state-owned enterprises, I don't suspect this would be changed overnight, but one, for example, might improve the corporate governance to make them more like a private sector company. One might be able to start to separate the role of the managers from kind of the shareholders as it would be in a private company. And then third, over time, there are different ways to diversify the holdings. So you could start to have multiple sources of investment. But the main point is that in general, what one has seen is that private sector companies feel the competition and the dynamism of change more. So to help China in the future adapt to move to different growth models, there probably would benefit from a larger role of private sector firms. Now, in addition, many of the retained earnings of the state-owned enterprises are a big boost to China's savings. So if there are ideas to try, for example, to expand consumption as opposed to the savings and investment, one could dividend out some of those retained earnings, and they might, for example, support some of the social protection programs.
As you mentioned, how would you comment on China's financial liberalization? Is there any area requires improvement?
China has taken some very significant steps, and some number of these were taken over 10 years ago to deal with some of the bad loans in the major state-owned banks. My own sense is that a healthy financial sector and a more diversified financial sector will be good for China. So this means to make sure there are sources of lending for small and medium-sized enterprises. For the innovation, you want to have venture capital. So one step in the process is to deepen the capital markets, not only rely on the big banks financing, but also have a variety of equity and bonds and other sources of funding. Because as you've seen in other parts of the world, including Europe, when the banks get in trouble, it's good to have a diversified source of alternative financing. I think the banks themselves also would benefit from moving from controlled interest rates to market interest rates. Right now they've got sort of a built-in spread in that area. So these would be further steps to commercialize the state-owned enterprises while also building a broader-based financial sector.
佐利克世行的同事林毅夫认为中国经济高增长还会持续20年。佐利克对此表示赞同，但他指出，按照世界各国经验，中国将面对中等收入陷阱的挑战，必须在国企改革、户籍开放、财政体系、社保制度等方向进行攻坚。
Your former colleagues, Justin Eveling, believes that the Chinese economy will continue growth in next 20 years. Do you as optimistic as Justin does?
I actually had a chance to see Justin recently when I came back to China, and I have great respect for the help he provided to me when he was chief economist at the World Bank, and he's written some very interesting books talking about China's changes, but also structural changes in the world economy. And I tend to agree that China can continue to have high growth, not as high growth necessarily as the past, not necessarily 10%, but 8%. But it does depend on addressing some of the long-term reforms. So China's at a very interesting juncture. You know, it's grown 10% a year for 30 years. That's an amazing historic achievement. But the structure and model of that growth will have to change. It'll have to move to more domestic consumption, domestic demand. That was recognized in the 11th and 12th five-year plans, but the implementation was perhaps slowed down because of the financial crisis. So I think one of the issues will be whether the new leadership team in China is able to drive the reform process on a host of these issues. Safety net, move closer to market for land, labor, economics, a host of other issues.
Would there any chance China's GDP amount to surpass Americans?
Well, that depends on these changes. But in pure mathematics, if China would grow at 7 or 8% because it's much larger population over time, it would. But predicting that is a very difficult task, when or how it will occur. And my other, I think, observation for China, having watched economies over 30 years, is one has to be very wary of straight line projections. I mean, China's had a very good, strong run, but one of the reasons I think it's important that the new leadership team are asking some of these questions is that sometimes approaches that work for one generation will not be the best for others. And for example, the Chinese growth pattern in the past has been very hard on China's environment. So now there needs to be a lot of cleaning up of some of that aspects of past cost.
When we look back at the development process of the Western countries, do you think what kind of mistakes should China avoid?
Well, there's a lot of lessons to learn, and that's one of the benefits of actually being a little later in the process. One is the need to continue to make these structural reforms. As we've seen, if countries have slowed down, this happened to Japan. I mean, Japan was a great growth model up to the 80s, and it didn't really open up its service sector. It struggled with structural reforms. Second, I think what we've seen in the world is the importance of continuing to run a good fiscal and monetary policy. If you let that out of control with inflation or other problems, then you have a fundamental issue. Social safety net programs. China is now starting to build social safety net programs. And there are ways to build these that can become very expensive and rigid, or there's ways to make them more flexible. So the work that we did in the bank with China was talking about some flexicurity ways of developing these programs. Environmental. Both some of the advanced industrialized countries, but China grew in a way that didn't pay as much attention to the environment. China, I think, now needs to reverse that. Urbanization. There's a big urbanization process going to go on in China, where China has about 50% of the population urbanized now. By 2030, it'll likely be 70%. So Li Keqiang has talked about the criticality of doing this right. It's not just a question of buildings or structures, but it's a question of approaching these in an environmentally sound way, trying to build knowledge clusters, making this a driving force of growth for China. So really you can look all across the spectrum of economics and say that there are lessons to be drawn, but each country has its unique characteristics, and they have to be customized for Chinese circumstances.
As you mentioned, do you believe that China will fall into the middle-income trap as Japan did within 5 years?
Well, Japan actually became an overall industrialized economy, but as your question suggests, one of the research observations that the World Bank made was that in 1960, there were 101 economies that were classified as middle income. And by 2008, so almost 50 years later, only 13 had made it to high income, and one of those was Greece. So you decide whether it's 12 or 13. So that's the issue that China will have to deal with. I believe China can overcome the hurdle. I think the very fact that this is a topic of debate in China is a very good sign. But it won't be easy, because as China has grown, you asked about state-owned enterprises, it's built in interest groups, and they don't necessarily want to have change. So I thought it was a very good sign that China, after 30 years of high growth, was willing to ask the questions about structural reform. But the challenge will be doing the sequencing of the various reforms, whether it be, the fiscal system. So, for example, one of the big issues in China, you have 5 levels of government. What degree should revenue sources be matched with expenditure sources? And as people have seen in China, if the local governments don't have sources of revenues, they will often rely on land sales, and that has a socially disruptive quality. So one needs to strengthen the fiscal system, work on the environmental issues, build a more innovation economy. And this would involve, for example, trying to have more tertiary level universities, intellectual property rights protection, venture capital. I mean, like NetEase as an example of, this is a company that is built, from 10 years, and as a private company, China needs more of that. And, will it get those sort of companies just from the state-owned enterprises? I don't think so. Issues like the hukou system, which restrict the movement of people, well, that needs to change, but one needs to change the social protection system so that those people can have their children educated and have health care. So the challenge, there are a lot of integrated issues here, and the challenge for the new leaders will be how they set a pathway that makes these structural reforms in a way that builds support as it goes.
Besides economy suggestions, do you have any other suggestions for China?
Well, I don't think it's so much a suggestion. I would just say that I think the other issue that I sense will be debated in China is what will be the role of the political reforms that will complement these economic reforms. So Xi Jinping has already started to talk about this, and his visit to Guangdong looks like a symbolic effort to talk about the need to move reforms forward. The appointment of Wang Qishan to play a role dealing with some of the corruption issues. That's part of the political question. And I think one of the challenges, particularly for younger Chinese, who live in a world of microblogging, is how will they get connected to the change and reform process. In some ways, some of the old system probably looks a little stiff and stilted to younger Chinese. Younger Chinese are a great source of energy and innovation. So I don't mean to suggest that there's one path or model to this, but I think one of the challenges for the leadership will be how they combine that political participation and integration and support, including trying to help some of those that are poorest and have been left behind, some of the social issues, with the challenges of growth going forward. And my last point is that, as China has been successful, it plays a larger role in the international system. So if I had a request, it would be that as China deals with its own internal issues, that I hope it works as a responsible stakeholder in the international system at large. And that's, I think, a point for the United States and Europe and Japan and others too.
美国今年以来频繁推出量化宽松政策，佐雷克认为量化宽松的目的是增长。中国如果担心通胀，可以使人民币升值。谈到中国持有的大量美国国债，佐雷克坦言，中国买国债不是搞慈善，而是出于货币政策。中国不会大幅抛售美国国债。
How you see President Obama said Americans need a reindustrialization? Does Americans' reindustrialization will impact China's position as the world factory?
This is the process of change in all economies. I think that some of the energy innovation in the United States is likely to lower costs for the manufacturing sector. I think as China's wage rates go up, it will have to change the nature of its manufacturing, and actually it will probably want to move up to more higher value-added production. And some of the lower wage, lower value-added production may move to other developing countries. But as for the U.S. manufacturing, those products can be sold in China. Some of them, with cross-investment, can be built in China. So the nature of economics should be a win-win venture. If the United States is a healthy manufacturing economy, and if China is, I think that can help both if one continues to have expansion of sources of demand. And one of the changes in the international system is that for decades, China and some of the other developing countries grew through export-led growth, exporting their manufactured and other goods to advanced economies. I think that's going to be changing now, in part because of the slowdown in advanced economies. So one of the challenges for China is building its own domestic demand, its own consumption, which also will benefit the Chinese people, but will also create different business opportunities.
Do you think American fiscal cliff is a political problem or is an economic problem?
Well, I think it's both. I think that as I look at the overall sort of medium-term prospects of U.S. business and U.S. economy, they are generally positive. The energy sector, some of the innovation, the companies have a lot of cash, but there's high uncertainty about government policy. Now, part of it is what the taxes will be. Part of it is whether the U.S. government can get control of its spending and its debt going forward. And so there are different views on how to approach this. My own belief is that there should be an opportunity to put together a pro-growth budget package, but that will require disciplining some of the long-term spending programs, the safety net programs that have been built in over time. And it looks like it would also need to involve revenues.
As far as I know, recently, American government launched the QE4. So from September to December, U.S. government launched the QE3 and the QE4 in a very short time. Many Chinese economists worry about that may worsen the inflation situation in China. So how do you think about this?
Well, the qualitative easing issues are also a controversial topic in the United States. I think that Chairman Bernanke of the Federal Reserve has tried to use them to support the growth of the United States. And that has been important for China because, particularly with the fall off in Europe's growth, even though the United States has been growing modestly, it's helped with the international system. So I think the purpose is not to try to affect the value of currency or others. It's a growth issue. But second, I think China is insulated from some of this because China does not have an open capital account. So the money doesn't easily flow into China. Some of the other developing countries may raise this issue. But third, if there is a concern, China could allow its currency to appreciate. And if its currency appreciates, that helps deals with any inflation concern. But nevertheless, I think it is a case that for the U.S. and globally, their Federal Reserve banks or central banks have sort of moved into very novel ground about monetary policy. And over time, this will pose sensitive issues because at some point they'll have to withdraw some of this financing.
Many scholars in China worry about that Americans' easy monetary policy will lower the value of the treasury bond held by China. So how do you think about this?
That relates to our discussion about whether the monetary policy also helps growth. If it helps growth in the United States, I think it will offset some of that. And again, I think the key point is that China's holding those dollars as part of its currency policy. And frankly, that many in the United States would talk about that as an imbalance. And the reason that China's held all those dollars is because it's had a much greater amount of exports over imports. And that goes back to the point that China's growth strategy was based on exports. So I think both in the United States and in China, there's the need for the rebalancing on these issues that would affect exchange rates, but it really goes to the fundamental issues we've been discussing about reliance more on domestic demand as opposed to exports, changing investment from some of the big, huge infrastructure projects to focus on urbanization. And those are the challenges for the next 10 years.
As we know, China bought a large amount of American treasury bond. Would Americans worry about that one day China would trigger a sell-off?
There is some discussion of that, and I think it shows some of the imbalances in the international economy. I personally don't think it would be very likely because if China sold a lot of dollar securities, it would reduce the value of all the other securities that it's sitting on. So this is where there's a mutual interest. And of course, you know, China, from the U.S. point of view, China buying dollar securities is not a charity. China's borrowing them in part because it was trying to maintain its currency at a certain value. So it was increasing demand for dollars so as to avoid the appreciation of the renminbi. And there are many in the United States that feel that the renminbi should still appreciate more, and that would mean actually not buying as many dollars. So the interconnections of these get a little complicated, but it really reflects how China's growth has integrated it into the international economy in ways that I don't think people would have expected 30 years ago.
佐利克认为，欧债危机实际上是三重问题：欧洲对中国和美国的需求将减少，欧元区将陷入发展困境。与此同时，新兴国家正在创造一个多极的世界经济，为增长创造了机会。
When would you expect the European debt crisis will come to the end? In what manner?
Well, I think this is a particularly difficult problem because it's really three different problems. Number one, it's the problem of large amounts of sovereign debt. Number two, it's a problem for the banking system, and the banks hold a lot of that sovereign debt. So if the value of the debt goes down, it hits the bank's capital. And third, for some countries, particularly in the Mediterranean, they have to improve their competitiveness. My own expectation is that Europe will muddle through, that Europe will be able to maintain the euro and it will deepen its own integration. But from a global perspective, I think that this is going to take a long time. And therefore, Europe is not likely to be the source of growth that it was for China and the U.S. and others in the past. And it's very complicated with the politics of reform. So in some ways, this applies to the U.S. and China as well. It's very hard to make the types of reforms that Europe has to make when they've got zero or very anemic growth. So one of the reasons why it's important for China to make reforms now is that it's easier if you're growing at 8%. And certainly for the U.S., if it delays making reforms, then it will hit a wall like Europe has. And then the political challenges of making the reforms become that much harder. So I think there are particular risks in Europe's case. There are some downside scenarios. You know, for example, if you talk about the politics and economics, Spain and Italy are the most important countries in terms of the risk. They're bigger. They both put in reform plans. But, for example, you just have seen that the Prime Minister of Italy, Mario Monti, who's done an excellent job, is likely to step down. There'll be elections. So what will the next Italian government be like in terms of reforms? And markets will react to that. So I think overall that sometimes people in the United States underestimate the European commitment to integration. I think it's strong, but I do think it's going to be a difficult path for many years.
How do you see America's economy will be affected by the European debt crisis within 3 years?
Well, I think both U.S. and China are likely to have less demand from Europe because Europe is going to be struggling and not growing as well. And there is some risk if you have shocks to the financial system that will affect all countries, just as the Lehman Brothers did. But I'm cautiously hopeful that the Europeans will manage this. And some of their recent actions dealing with Greece and the banking supervisory system, show that while it may be slower than some would like, it's on the pathway for reform.
Where is the next growth point for the global economy? That will be the Golden Brick countries.
If you look at the past 10 years, the developing countries as a whole have provided 2/3 of global growth, or 5 years, past 5 years. And if you compare that with the 1990s, those countries provided only, say, in the 20s or 25% of global growth. So you have a big shift structurally with the role of emerging markets. But as our discussion of China suggests, there's no straight path. So Brazil has been slowing down, India has been slowing down. So over the long run, I believe that the emerging markets are going to create a multipolar economy, and that this creates opportunity for growth. But many of those countries will also have to struggle with what we've discussed with China, which is the so-called middle income trap. So the China 2030 report that the World Bank produced with China earlier this year was an effort to try to get at some of the structural issues for middle income countries so that they keep on a growth path.